Hey coders, I'm here today with a walkthrough to show you how to integrate the Stripe API into your full stack web applications. As a quick rundown, Stripe is a full payment processing platform targeted for developers. It allows you to make subscriptions, charge credit cards, use Apple Pay, charge bank accounts. There's so many things you can do, and the cool part about it all is that Stripe shoulders the PCI compliance. It's a really expensive and very stringent security certification for anyone that has to hold credit card data, which Stripe allows us to circumvent. Stripe deals with all of the credit card data. That way that information never touches our servers, which makes it easy for us to integrate and use in our full stack web apps with no trouble whatsoever. So to jump right in, we have to have a Stripe account. So moving on from my boilerplate here, which is clearly just running the Hello World application. It's the very same bare bones boilerplate you can get from one of the previous labs. If not, I'll try and have a link down in this video. All it does is it has an Express backend with a React frontend using TypeScript, and it doesn't really do anything magical. Again, it's just to show that you can integrate these things at the bare minimum amount of code that doesn't require a lot of syntax or a lot of special structure in your folders or anything like that. All you have to do is just integrate at the right places and you're good to go. So back to the Stripe website now. Once you register for an account and you go through the authorization process, they may ask for a credit card to have on file. They never actually charge. In the same vein that you probably had to do in your Mailgun.js integrations, they essentially have it on file for security purposes in case all of a sudden someone gets one of your API keys. But if we stay in developer land where we have a test key that we can play with, it really shouldn't matter. After you go through the verification process, you will have access to this dashboard link at the top of your navbar. Popping into it, and it gives us a quick little rundown of what information your current account is doing here. So I made a cool $100 today, which makes my night, even though it's just test data, it's still pretty cool to see that I've made money tonight, and considering I haven't used this for some time to demo, it's cool to see all of a sudden I had this charge that worked correctly right before I shot this video. What you're going to want to do is be going through the verification part of your account here, just verifying your email, and that's pretty much all you're going to have to do. You should have this developer section down here that gives you more information of what you need, specifically your API keys. Now, Stripe is unique in that it has two keys you're going to want. A secret key for your backend charging, and a front-end key to help tokenize credit cards. So this part of the video will actually focus on the front end, as the back end is actually fairly simple compared to Mailgun that required more setup on the back end. So the front end, we're actually going to want this key right here, and you do not... The front end key is publishable, meaning you can actually have it hard-coded into your component and it won't actually cause any issues. All it does is help verify that we can tokenize credit cards that Stripe can deal with. Now, the secret key is, again, something you don't want to push to GitHub. You don't want it hard-coded in your templates at all. It's something you want to have to deal with a configuration file or some environment variables, like a .env, for example, is a popular one to use to hide information away from GitHub and away from deployment to make sure we keep this secret key secret. So after I reveal it and use it in this video, I will probably have to re-roll it. Okay, so with that in mind, their documentation on Stripe is very good. Just like I had mentioned in the Mailgun.js videos, navigating through their documentation and picking and choosing parts that you need for your code is the most important thing about being a developer, integrating pretty much any third-party API. I'm going to choose to open their documentation here to get a quick gander of things we might need to hook up and get this guy working. So they again have the older syntax, so we're going to be upgrading this to the import-export style, and we'll also be including TypeScript in our particular demo today. At a minimum, it looks like we have to have the Stripe library. We provided a key of some kind. Let's see. This is actually not what we want. Let's go look at payments. Securely collecting payment information, like I had said, they handle all of the information on the front end. You know, when a user types in these forms, it's actually going to Stripe's API and not actually touching our code, which is great. You'll notice here that they provide a series of test numbers, one for Visa cards being 42424242, etc. And we can actually use that as a test card to see if our form is wired up correctly. We're getting a token sent back to us, and we can actually successfully charge this test card. Let's see. So moving on from there, if we want to create some charges, we actually have the option to go to Node to see how we might do so. This will actually be more of a backend integration because we're going to be using a special library called Stripe React or React Stripe Elements to generate the front end for us. But on the back end, it can be fairly simple. You have to require Stripe with its configuration secret key. You get some kind of token from the front end. We can hard code an amount, and we do something called stripe.charges.create. It creates a charge with an amount, the type of currency, a brief description, the token from the front end, which will be the important part. And it's actually customizable with a whole host of metadata you might want to include. This request and response body that Stripe provides is massive, and we can spend an hour going through it in this video and probably learn not much else than just diving in and checking out what we can get going here. Like I mentioned earlier, for the front end, we're going to be using Stripe or React Stripe Elements in order to get this up and running on the front end. I don't think they have a demo on this, but we can actually go to the React Stripe Elements library here, or their GitHub page, where we can look at some of their documentation. The interesting thing about the front end of using React Stripe Elements, so we install the module first off, but you'll notice that they actually wrap our checkout form in a special higher order component called a Stripe provider. It actually injects our nested child component with this API key information and everything else it might need. The next step is including this elements component as well. So we have our checkout form, which is actually an elements component, which has our injected checkout form within. And well, I mentioned the higher order component earlier. This is actually where it takes place, which will be actually injecting our form with the inject Stripe higher order component. So this takes our nested component, injects it with information that Stripe needs to know. That way it can draw it out of our form component. And checking it out here, we are provided this props.stripe.create token that can take some customization. At the very minimum, it looks like it just needs a name, and then that is a promise that should generate the token, which we're going to be console logging ourselves here in a minute. And the React Stripe Elements library actually provides a lot of really cool components that you can use to customize these forms. We're going to keep it fairly simple and just build something out of scratch using Bootstrap and in our templates. It won't look very fancy, but it'll have just enough to get us up and running in no time. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and begin installing the things we need. So in my terminal here, I don't know if y'all can see that. It's actually listening on the server. I'm going to clear that out. And yeah, okay. We're going to have to do an npm install and save these particular things. We're going to need to have, let's see, for the front end, React Stripe Elements. We're going to want the typings for that as well, which are fairly up to date. So typings, React Stripe Elements. I believe we're going to need Stripe for the back end. We'll want the typings for that as well. Oop. There we go. And that should be enough to get us up and running. While that's installing and saving to our package JSON, I believe I already have this in my HTML, but if you do not have this script, this will not work. You must have this Stripe script in your index.html in order to utilize their API on the front end with your React components. That way they can handle the tokenization of those credit cards for us. So please don't forget that, as I might have and spent an embarrassingly large amount of time trying to find out why I had messed up coding this demo out today. So take 2 here hopefully goes a bit smoother. Again, this is just the bare bones template that was provided for us by the Covalence GitHub, which I'll have a link in this description again if you need it. And we're going to go ahead and remove this component will not. I don't really care about that, or this piece of state. And this is going to start throwing a TypeScript error at us here. Cool. So I'm just doing a little bit of cleaning up because I don't really need all this particular information down here working like so. We're going to remove those guys there. I don't even need these. I'm just going to put in some shadow divs, some shadow fragments like that. And I don't even think I'm going to need this constructor for state up on this guy either. What we will need, however, are those two elements that I demoed from the React Stripe elements documentation earlier. I'm going to make sure this is actually finished installing before, okay. And I'll go ahead and just start my server up and running, and we'll be checking periodically to make sure I haven't broken anything, which we'll see how long that takes before that happens. Cool. She's up and running again. I'm going to have an error thanks to this line, so I'm going to remove that before I go any further. Yes, yes. Called it. Webpack is rebuilt, is listening. I'm coming back to my code here and refreshing. Okay, the hello world's gone, but that's expected because I removed everything from the render. So, moving on. Like I was saying, we're going to have to import two particular elements from that library. So I'm going to go ahead and do an import from React Stripe elements. And we're going to need the Stripe provider. There it is. Thank you, IntelliSense. Always useful. And the elements components. And in our render down here, that's when I'm going to have my Stripe provider, which if you recall from their documentation, had to be wrapping the elements component. And that's where our form will be actually wrapped itself. But I haven't created that yet, so I'm going to go ahead and finish out coding this guy. And the API key is the attribute that this particular component needs, which will be a string, which I'll be snagging from my dashboard, which after you've gone through the verification process, you should have a similar one. Remember, this is a front end, so we need our publishable front end API key. I'm going to paste that in there. And we're going to need some kind of form element. So I'm going to go ahead and create just a new file called form.tsx. And I'm going to go ahead and import it in this file here. Import form from this directory form. There we go. And yes, I know it doesn't exist because nothing's in there. And I'm going to go ahead and say my form needs to be here. Okay, cool. With that little tidbit done there, let's go ahead and move on. This is where I'm going to import React from the React library for TypeScript. We're going to go ahead and bring in a couple things from the React Stripe elements library. And I pulled this from their documentation and through looking from their typings. So I found out what we needed to have in order to have this work. The card element will actually be the piece and component that will handle displaying the card number, the expiration date, and the CV, the security code, right? We need those 3 bits of information to charge even our test card, and this card element component already has that coded in for us and handles the information of it. That means all we got to do is style it and call it a day, which is awesome. We're going to need that inject Stripe function. Remember, that would wrap our component and inject it with these props from Stripe provided for us. And then we're also going to need this React Stripe elements namespace because it has an interface on it that we're going to want. Kind of like in the React Router DOM and TypeScript video, you had to provide an extended interface for our props that had the route component props. It will provide like this.props.push, .replace.history, or this.props.mash.params, in the same sense that if we have something called this.props.stripe.createToken, TypeScript won't know what that is unless we provide the typings for what create token is and what the Stripe prop is. So that's where we're going to be getting that from, this React Stripe elements that comes from downloading the, or installing the types for React Stripe elements. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one of these. We'll do a class form extends react.component. I'll take our generics when we get there. And at first I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick render. The render will have just an H1 that says form. And this is something I like to do with most of my components. I always just like to make sure that I correctly wire them up with a quick H1 test, then I actually start filling out what it says. It's going to export defaults. Remember, this is that higher order component. We are wrapping this component with some kind of function that injects it with some props or information provided by a different component, aka our Stripe provider component. So we're going to be injecting our form when we export it. And because we are coding in TypeScript, we're going to have to provide an interface for iForm props. And again, you can call this whatever you want. In this particular instance, I'm just having to call it this. I call it I for interface, the component name, and then props, and one more for state. This is not a requirement. This is just a common practice. And iForm state. Okay, and I have to pass those generics in. We're going to do an iForm props and iForm state. Cool, there we go. With those two provided in there, oh, I knew I forgot. We needed to have a return for our render method. That was a bare minimum for any React class-based component. Cool. And we'll give that error a second to rebuild. Webpack should rebuild. The server's listening. Coming back to my Chrome browser here. Form. Okay, cool. And it's just giving me a little warning saying I'm testing this and developing this on HTTP, not HTTPS, which throws this convenient warning saying, hey, Stripe doesn't like this, so make sure you secure it before you start using Stripe. But for development purposes, we don't really care about that, and we can just ignore that nice little warning there. Cool. So with that little build out there, let's start making out our form here. So this is going to be a main that will have the class name of container, just something to house our form in. And if we need the Bootstrap row column system, we can always use that within there. Always a fan of bringing that in when I possibly can. We have a form element of some kind here, where it's going to be wrapping everything we have. And just like with other Bootstrap, I'm going to go ahead and build out the basic form group. We're going to bump it off the top of the screen a little bit, give it a border. We're going to give it a primary border color, because why not? It's going to be a slightly rounded border, and we'll give it a big old shadow. There we go. Nothing magical, just using a bunch of Bootstrap SaaS stuff that have access to in this particular template. So I like to have some fun with it. And even though this won't be like a professional looking design, I just like having a little bit of fun with it and making it look a bit neater than something incredibly bland, like a raw form element from HTML. Well, there's no guts to it right now, so it looks like a straight line because it's just a blank form with no height. Nice. Cool. So we're going to have a label for our very first input field here, which, not required, but we're just going to go ahead and label the input, and we'll call it name, because it's going to be our first input. And our input is going to be a type text. And we're going to go ahead and put these attributes on new lines to make it easier to read, to make sure it doesn't scroll off the page on us here. There we go. It'll be at type text. Let's give it a weeb styling, the input group. We're going to give it some vertical margins, just a hair of padding, because why not, right? Then we'll give it a border with a border dark. Then it's going to need a value tied to some piece of state, which we haven't made yet. So we're going to say this.state.name. And it's going to throw an error at me until I wire that up. So let's go ahead and just do that while we're at this point in time. So we have a constructor that must receive our props, which will also be shipping up iForm props. We'll start name off as a blank string, and I'll have to, of course, go down here to my state to say name is going to be a type string, and that should correct everything. All right, cool. So now we're going to have an onChange event handler here for updating our piece of state, which will be an event. And if you don't know what I'm typing here, this comes from the using React TypeScript and change elements, and the onChange elements and handlers. So it's going to be a change event, and it'll be an HTML form input, or in HTML element input, was it? Oh no. Oh no, it was an HTML input element. That's what it was. Nope, wrong IntelliSense. And the wrong undo. There we go. There we are. Now we got it. And again, like I was kind of rambling about a second ago, if you don't know where this is coming from, watch the React TypeScript and onChange events. That'll actually help illuminate exactly what I'm typing here and what it means. So with this handler here, I have a this.setState, which should be updating name with the e.target.value. That way when we type in this input, it updates state, which causes this value to also be re-rendering. Cool. And that should round it out for what we need on that guy. And rather than hard code an amount, I'm going to be lazy and just copy and paste this guy here. This one's going to be also an amount. This will actually be adjusting the amount. There we go. The amount, it'll be captured as a string as well, not a number. So if you do any kind of parsing, we can either do that here before we send the data off, or we can do that on the back end. It shouldn't really matter from there. Cool. So then we had amount, which is our other piece of state, which will also start as a blank string. So come in and see what we've got so far. Hopefully, okay, it looks like our form could probably use a hair of padding as well to look a bit nicer there, because everything's just kind of stuck against the border of the form there. There's a refresh. All right, I was waiting for Webpack to rebuild. Okay, not bad so far. It's getting there, that's for sure. And that's where we're going to go ahead and be using our card element components. So beneath these guys, we have our card element component that is provided for us by the React Stripe Elements library. And like I said earlier, we can actually pass this guy some kind of styling. So we'll give him some padding, since I forgot that earlier. Remember it this time. And some bordering on the guy, just to give it some style on it. That should be all we need. And I'm going to have a button JSX element in here that will say charge it. There we go. Or if I can learn to spell, bouton. It's not French. Class name, and as usual, button primary. So are my favorites to go to. And because everything else has a border dark, I might as well just go ahead and do that as well. And because we're using a form, I shouldn't need to have an on-click handler on this. I'm actually going to put it as an on-submit on the form itself. Cool. Oh yeah, we probably could use some kind of label for our little card element here. So let's do one of those as well. Again, this has nothing to do with the actual integration of the API. This is just setting up your front-end form to be ready to post that API route when we actually code it. So we had our CC number. Then I think it was our expiration date, followed by our CBC, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that should be good. And then because that button was right up against that guy, we'll go ahead and give that guy a little bit extra space as well. Right. There we go. That's a little bit nicer. Nothing perfect, but it's better than just a bland form, and it can show us our functionality if it's working or not. So we have a name that should be updating, an amount should be updating, and this card element should be handling itself. Now for the fun part. We're going to have an on-submit handler on this form. So just like with my inputs, I'm going to give myself some space to work with here and say it is an on-submit change handler. That will be an event of a React.change event, which will accept the HTML form element, and that will actually utilize this .handle submit. We'll pass the event in there. There we go. So we have to make that actual class method now, where handle submit is class method. There we go, which we'll do in event.prevent default, because we do not want the handle submit. Ugh, I can't spell. I was like, well, why is IntelliSense not finishing this? There we go. Which will handle our form from refreshing the page, because we don't want that to happen in React, right? Okay. And let's just console log test real quick, just to make sure I haven't messed anything up quite yet. Oh, hold on. Maybe Webpack hasn't refreshed yet. Parameter E has implicitly any type. Interesting. What have we forgotten here? This.handle submit, this.handle submit, E.prevent default. It's a React.change event. No, everything should be passed in there correctly, strangely enough. Wonder if we change our context binding to be like this. We define what it is up here instead. Since we're doing an inline, I don't think it was passing the typings up through that arrow function into the class helper method. So if we move it up here, it should work. Fingers crossed. There we go. There we go. That's what the problem was. It wasn't passing up the typing of that event up into the class helper method. So we defined that up there instead of down there. So that little refactor right there, we should be able to accidentally click on Discord and load that up in the background. Lovely. But if we click on this guy and refresh and actually click on charge it, there's our test console log. So now we're wired up. And again, this is why I advocate that even if you've been coding for a long time and you feel like you got a good handle on this, wiring up little console log tests for a button submit like that, still a good thing to do. Otherwise, I would have gone forward in this demo and then gotten completely lost when my event was still refreshing the page. So, like I mentioned earlier, always a good thing to be testing as you're going. So this guy is going to be making eventually a fetch post request to our API route for Stripe, which we haven't written yet, but that'll be the next video. So we're going to go ahead and add that async keyword there so I can do the await syntax down here for our promises. And we'll just throw the error if it occurs. And then this is where we're going to be doing our fetch logic and our promises to get the token. So let's try and snag our token. And this is where I mentioned earlier, kind of like with route component props, we're going to have to bring in whatever this.props.stripe provides for us. So our component in TypeScript won't know that this by default, but because we have React Stripe elements available here, we will have that namespace and its interfaces available for our props. So if we extend the React Stripe elements namespace, it has something called injected Stripe props available as an exported interface from its typings. With this little change up here, our TypeScript and IntelliSense should now know exactly what this.props.stripe is, along with the one we want, create token. And that is awesome. So like we saw from their documentation, and I mentioned earlier, this can take a good bit of configuration, but we're just going to give it a name, and that'll actually be the same value of this.state.name. So whatever the user types as their name into that field, we'll be creating this token with. And the amount is actually something separate from the token, so we don't actually care about that in this particular demo. So I'm going to console.log the token. There we go. Make sure Webpack has rebuild here. There we go. Come back to our form, refresh the page, type in my name, Luke Skywalker. The amount, again, didn't matter. I'll put in 100 for now. And remember that test key I'd mentioned earlier? All we gotta do is hit 4.2 all the way across the line until we get that posted in. So we're gonna click on the charge it button. And if the promise resolves correctly, we get this token object, which has our ID on it along with some other metadata. So if you're getting this successful token ID here, then you are set and ready to go. That means all we have to do now is wire this front-end component up to a back-end API route via a fetch post request, which, in order to keep this video a tad shorter than 30 minutes, I'm going to try and put into another video. So I'll see you all soon for the back-end integration of exactly what we did here together. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and leave them in the questions discussions underneath this video in Gravity. Other than that, hope you all have a great time. Bye.